This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 613, and it's September 5th, 1983. We number those every week so that you can keep track of what time and what broadcasts different items were discussed. And then through the years, if you record these off the air or get the tapes, you can enjoy seeing how these events unfold. We usually start the program with what was happening a year ago tonight. A lot of coincidences in the one-year cycle. Every time that I look up what I was talking about a year ago tonight, it's in the news tonight. And that's kind of interesting. I was talking last year about The Circle. That was September 6, 1982. The book by Steve Shagan, S-H-A-G-A-N, about the Korean KCIA, the CIA, the gun running, the assassination teams coming out of Korea, the heroin and the drug traffic, the use of Pusan, sending the narcotics from Pusan, P-U-S-S-A-N, to Palermo. And Mr. Habib, who is now, he'd been working, going back and forth to the Middle East, was the ambassador to South Korea and the bagman for Koreagate. I was talking about the murder of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, C-H-I-E-S-A, an investigator for the Banco Ambrosiano and Roberta Calvi. And also, I was talking about the importance of secret societies and the Opus Dei and the crackdown on the Jesuits. The appointment of a new Jesuit chief that February 23rd, 1982, the Pope decided that he would strip power and decisions from the Jesuits, that they were too liberal. And they had a meeting with President Ronald Reagan, and he gave orders to Mr. Arrupe, A-R-R-U-P-E, that the Jesuits would have to have a commissar or a czar, which is the first time in 442-year history of the Jesuits, because they're too left-wing for the radical right part of the church, the Opus Dei. So while a Jesuit priest is assigned this for life and voted for life as the head of the Jesuit order, he was told by John Paul II, who worked for I.G. Farben at Auschwitz and has kept up his Auschwitz fascist tradition. He was told he would have to leave the order. That was 1 year ago. Today I was talking about it, and just today in the San Francisco Chronicle and New York Times, Jesuit leader bids farewell to his order. The Very Reverend Pedro de Arrupe, A-R-R-U-P-E, and then a small y, G-O-N-D-R-A, that's his full name, said goodbye yesterday to the society he led for more than 18 years, and he had many friends there, and he espoused the liberal view on social and religious matters. Arrupe was a missionary in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb hit, and it's the first time in the history of the Society of Jesuits that he literally was forced to resign. That has to do with our CIA, with the National Security Agency, with Ronald Reagan dictating what happens in the Vatican and how they have to step down. Last week I was talking about Western Goals. Next Sunday night, September the 11th, there's going to be a program that was put together by the late Larry MacDonald. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and then you can reduce your 3 hours or 2 hours Central and Western. Channel 3, and if you don't have it, go to somebody who has cable TV. It's called No Place to Hide. Now I know, looking at the provocation of the Korean Airline and the dumping of Larry MacDonald, who it was time to unload because of his links to the subpoenas that he got for the Los Angeles Police Department and his other connecting links, it was time to sacrifice him and make him a martyr. John Birch was a Christian in China who was killed, and Mr. Robert Welch formed the John Birch Society because the communists took over China and a young John Birch had been killed. Now we have a congressman, as Mr. Phillips was on television today saying, the first congressman killed by the Reds, a member of the United States Congress. Now the show is made, and they can martyr and begin the martyrdom of a sleazy guy from the mafia, from organized crime, from the Assassination Bureau, from drug dealing all over the world that supported him in his campaign. Mr. Sleazy, Larry MacDonald, will become the darling of the right, and we must keep out in the public all the things he did. Western Goals is his organization, his data bank on you and me and just about everybody listening to this. headed by Larry MacDonald. I mentioned it last week on the broadcast, number 612. Admiral Thomas Moore is one of the members of Western Goals. Roy Cohn of the Syndicate. Moore works with Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. Vice Admiral Lloyd Munston. General George S. Patton. He's got a who's who. Patton is the son of the general who stalled the war and got into the Battle of the Bulge to clean up the missing millions and billions that were transferred from Germany to research the Nazis afterwards. Dr. Edward Teller will do more about Western Goals. I mentioned Larry MacDonald last week. I mentioned him a lot, and within 3 days after that broadcast, he was dead, but he isn't gone, and it's up to you people to do research on him and share these pieces of information so that he doesn't get this great cloak of the only member of Congress who fought communists so hard. That's what they were saying this week when he died. Before we get on to the plane crash, I just want to mention again that book out on John DeLorean. There is a new book on John DeLorean, on the life of DeLorean, The Rise and Fall of John DeLorean by Ivan Fallon, Fallon, and James Srodes, Srodes. And briefly, it says that when DeLorean left General Motors, he was on the salary of Cadillac Company and General Motors and lived in Washington, D.C., and was getting $200,000 a year. And this book describes that his social life, he had picked up his glamorous third wife, Christina Ferrari, Ferrare. And this story says that the alliance of him with the General Motors was in Washington, D.C., and this couple threw themselves into the social world of a city, just settling down to Nixon's second term in the White House. It was a Washington still unruffled by Watergate. And it tells about DeLorean and his year with the automobile company, where he got $200,000 stipend from General Motors, and then an extra bonuses and money. And he whirled around with a social crowd from Detroit business executives with a Hollywood past and Henry Kissinger, the swinging Secretary of State. Is it any wonder that John DeLorean ends up on the board of Chris Kraft that owns 20% of 20th Century Fox with Henry Kissinger on the board? DeLorean did a lot of wheeling and dealing and dirty work, and it was interesting to see that this book does bring up the John DeLorean story. Well, I guess we'll get back to right now, begin with Flight 007. That's James Bond, License to Kill. In case many of you haven't figured it out, you have. That was the Boeing aircraft that went down, the Korean aircraft that went down. Ronald Reagan was absolutely frightening. He had an article, he didn't mention this on the air, but it was in the paper today, he's about the Russians and how barbaric and civilized and cold-blooded. He keeps saying this. But then there was another story it was in the Washington Post today, and it quotes somebody from the senior administration official that says, in quotes, "We have started the wheels in motion to isolate the Soviets from an aviation standpoint." Now, the goal for war is 1985. We have started the wheels in motion. I bought a game a few years ago on how we would do the strategy for war in 1985. When it comes, you can remember we started the wheels. There was a picture of Ronald Reagan. He came home from the ranch. There's a photograph with him lined up at a table, and some are smiling. He doesn't look too concerned. He's with Edwin Meese from California, who ran the SLA operation in the San Quentin Six, and Meese was responsible for the People's Park and gunning down a person there, the bloodbaths in California, and then he went east with him. There's Mr. James Baker, the staff of George Bush, Murder Incorporated again, with the Nugan connections to Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson. Then he's sitting with Mr. O'Neill, Thomas O'Neill, the Democratic leader in the House, who was heavily involved with Koreagate at the time of the scandals with Tong Sun Park and the payoffs and the little girls behind the rooms of the Senate and the House. He was involved and could hang on to his seat there and be a spokesman for Ronald Reagan. He's sitting right next to him as part of Koreagate, and next to him is Howard Baker, and Baker was the senator who covered up the Senate Watergate and snitched to Richard Nixon, what was going on at night. And then there's Robert Byrd, a big spokesman for punishing the Soviets, but you ask his relatives why the papers are locked up of Admiral Byrd's secret Antarctic expeditions with Nazis Antarctica, and you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. A bunch of thieves sitting at a table where blood spilling doesn't mean a thing to them, and trying to act very righteous. Now, what happened with the airplane? I'll give you my analysis, and we'll hold it up to some kind of a scope a year from now and see how it hangs in. Only three things could have happened. This is the way I figure it. It's been 5 days since the plane crash went down. Number one, the United States warned and knew it was the Soviet Union rather, warned the airplane and knew it was a commercial airline and shot it down and didn't care what was happening. They just blew it up, could care less, the hell with you, this is what we're doing. That's one of the choices, okay? Then there's another choice. It was an accident, that they believed it was the spy plane that they flies close to commercial airlines, they finally announced, to hide the spying. Well, that isn't fair on commercial airlines when you take a trip somewhere to know that under your petticoat is a spy plane and that you get through as a commercial because the radar picks up the commercial. They thought it was a spy plane and they shot it down, and that's the other choice, that they were defending their territory. And then the third choice is that it was a planned provocation by Ronald Reagan, the CIA, and the National Security Agency. Well, you don't have to wait an hour to find out what I think it was, and I'll tell you the reasons I think it was a planned provocation. In the first place, they wanted to heighten the Cold War tensions. Ronald Reagan didn't get through the idea of the gas line of Europe sharing the gas with the Soviet Union, and he wants to break up any possible détente taking place among the Allies. Spain has gone socialist. Italy is socialist in a way. France is socialist. Bolivia, Greece, and they seem to be able to coexist without great trauma. And there are too many of the allies trying to listen and get along with the Soviet Union right now. In fact, 8 senators, members of Congress, were in the Soviet Union for 2 weeks and came home. And then right away the article said, see, won't they ever learn they trusted the Russians? The second thing is that he's always wanted to reactivate the House Un-American activity. That was Larry MacDonald's shtick. And with a martyr like Larry and telling how awful the communists are and the terrorists in this country, he will try to pursue this. This is something they've had on the boards for a long time. Another thing they want to do is to silence the critics of the missile deployment that will take place this winter in Europe. And if you listen and read the newspapers and listen to the news, how could you trust the Russians? See, we told you, we need the missiles in Europe. Don't listen to the peace people. They're barbaric. They're heinous crimes. We can't stand it. Another thing they want to do is to increase the tensions against the Russians to support Central America. Henry Kissinger is there with his bloodbath moving to Central America. So all of a sudden they're saying, see, we're right. If they'll do that there and they take over Cuba and all these various waters, we're right to get the Russians out of Central America. You can't trust them anywhere when they blow up families sitting on airplanes. The next thing is to discourage any kind of trade with the Soviet Union that would better them, whether it's computer work or any kind of cultural exchange, to cut it off. The third is to justify Mr. Nakasoni's demand for more and more weapons in Japan. He went to Harvard. He was a protege of Fritz Kramer and close to Henry Kissinger, and he's asking this week very nicely, see, we need these weapons. Japan has to have these weapons. We told you how terrible it is, and he's already decided when he went in, the Japanese people didn't want a budget with weapons, but now when you see how terrible the Russians are, you need the weapons. He was trying to align China and Japan and the United States against the Soviet Union by saying, we will protect you. They are lawless people. They don't apologize. They don't explain. He wants to crush all liberals. The liberals' name is used in articles I cut out this week over and again, and some are worse than others. And they had to be written in advance because nobody could get out this much stick in 1 week. I just have piles and piles of outrageous articles that came within a day of the crash, and they didn't even know if the plane still was around. There wasn't a trace. Another point is to get rid of Larry MacDonald at a time where he's been subpoenaed for his documents with the LAPD because he is a middleman to the mafia, to the military, to the Mr. Habash over in Lebanon, to Chile, to the syndicate, to the Lockheed people out of DeKalb County in Georgia. And once the Civil Liberties Union has documents and begins to subpoena his Western goals, it's time to sacrifice him and make him a martyr. Now, there were a lot of shifting sands this week. I hadn't seen so much going on since last year. It was in June of 1982 where events were moving very quickly. Benigno Aquino was killed in the Philippines, and he certainly left the back burner. There isn't much about the person who shot him except that they admit he was a hired killer and belonged to the crime syndicate, so that certainly would fit in with the Marcos family. Senator Henry Jackson went to China. He told them that there were better days ahead. He was working with Red China as against Taiwan. He was a friend of Israel, and they depended on him to be a spokesman for the airplane that went down for the Russian propaganda in the Boeings that put him into office, the Boeing plane that went down. And he got on the television and talked about that dastardly act, and then he died the same night. Maybe the pressure of lying, because he was briefed about the airplane just as Earl Warren was briefed about who killed John Kennedy. The pressure, probably, I would bet, if he was given the inner story about that airplane, because how much could they tell? And he was briefed. He went to bed, he watched himself on television and said, I feel sick, and went to bed and died. I feel sick, too. So Representative Larry MacDonald of Western Goals, who was just subpoenaed a few days ago for his papers to the LAPD, is gone. Aquino, Jackson, MacDonald. People that are out are Father Pedro Arrupe that I mentioned, out of the Jesuits. Senator John Tower betrayed the people in the Senate Foreign Relations and quickly got out. I mentioned him last week and said, I resign. Mr. Begin got out of Israel and said, I'm leaving, and they refer to that as a mystery resignation. And Licio Gelli got out of the Swiss jails. The reason I mention these things, that every single one of these incidences taps Larry MacDonald, Western Goals, Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, and company. Now, what investigations were going on at this time? See, it's important to know why the plane would go down and what was happening at the time, because that's a clue to, if it would be a conspiracy, what would they want to be covering up and how much would these various people know, particularly Larry MacDonald, but also to escalate a situation with Korea that takes your eyes off of the news. Not that the news covers it so much, but the investigation with Los Angeles Police Department, for the first time, Larry MacDonald's name made the front page of the Washington Post, August 18th, 1983, regarding Western Goals, and within a week and a half, he was dead. Licio Gelli is still being investigated with his money tied up in the Italian banking scandals and the Nazi P2 organization. Klaus Barbie in France, and all of these people have connecting links to Larry MacDonald down in Georgia, and two reasons why Ronald Reagan would keep hinting away at the Russians as being bad, because every one of these things involves the CIA, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party, and some of the Democrats, the Klaus Barbie story with the CIA and the drug connections with the anti-Castro Cubans in Miami, the Mark Rich investigation with Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and William Rogers on the same board of Fox, the John DeLorean scandal where he subpoenaed the CIA, the National Security Agency, the FBI documents, the Banco Ambrosiano, the trials going on in Italy, the Milan trial of Stibam, S-T-I-B-A-M, the drugs, the weapons, the Ajah shooting of the Pope that turned out not to be Bulgarian, and now they've silenced it because it's linked to the CIA, and the Nuganan Bank in Australia. All of these things are being investigated right at this time. So what Ronald Reagan needs is a good diversionary to say that these people are beasts. And everything that I've listed above has to do with mass murder, with drugging, with extortion, with singling out money from countries, of starving people and flowing the dollars other places. Our allies are in trouble, and he has to show how bad the Russians are, because our allies are in trouble. Pakistan is having riots against Zia. Turkey, repressive government. The Philippines with Marcos. Chile wants to get rid of Pinochet. They're obstructing Israel, change their dictators. Situations are bad there, and the people are getting restless. Brazil is broke. Argentina is broke. El Salvador is repressing worse than ever, and every major country that took loans is bankrupt. Poland has a $50 million it owes the Vatican. They have about $100 million more down the drain, and Solidarity didn't go. The CIA set it up. It didn't wash. Poland's in charge, and it was money down the drain, and our banks are empty. Bolivia, France, Greece are socialists, and Spain, and that being civilized is a threat to Ronald Reagan, who has to whip this lather up. The Russians are bad. The Russians are barbaric. The Russians are terrible. And he gets himself into this tizzy because he wants to divert you from every single one of these things That is happening. That is not being analyzed in the news. Maybe Nightline, a program, well, not Nightline, but Jessica Savage had a thing on Roberta Calvi, one on Klaus Barbie. It's a miracle if any of the national television goes into depth for 1 hour every 6 months on one of these subjects. The Wall Street Journal is talking about it, and New York Times, and Washington Post, and London Observer. It's in the news. I'm not scrounging around for news, but you're not hearing about it. And the President of the United States isn't addressing himself to any one of these things that ties him in with Roy Cohn and Henry Kissinger and Admiral Moore and Senator John Tower and the whole sleazy gang. So these provocations could break up and tamper the plans that the president has. Now, how could the provocations take place on this airplane? The Soviet Union said this was a United States provocation that you set up. How could we set it up? I'll give you some examples when we talk about the airplane. What would you do if you wanted to outfit a plane in New York City that goes up to Anchorage and then takes your congressman and makes a martyr out of him and blows a plane and blames the Soviet Union when you know that's their territory? There's certain things you have to do, and if you don't do them, the plan won't work. But if you do all of them, the chances are that it is a provocation. And the airline pilots say this was a provocation set up with the equipment, and they recognize that. They are outraged. They say it's impossible. Well, impossible is only possible when the people who control the airplane and the technique for covering it up work together. Number one, you have to tamper with the Korean airline radio instruments, and they weren't working. They did not receive messages or acknowledge conversation with a threat or a suggestion that they land at another place. The second, you have to silence the pilots in some way that there's no indication of their awareness and no response. Now, Korea and Tokyo are the headquarters of the mind control program. Colston Westbrook was there, the SLA people were trained there. The COINTEL programs discuss the FBI documents on Operation Chaos and COINTEL. The Korean and the Japanese centers have been identified for mind control and experimentations, and United States Army bases in Tokyo and in Japan. Reverend Moon is the largest example of mass mind control there is. Now, those pilots in some way either had to be drugged or be tampered with mentally after their last day because nothing is coming through. The only thing they said was, we're going to go up 35,000 feet from 32,000. And that's the last thing they said. And they'd been missing 7 hours, and they'd been followed for 2.5 hours. Now, that is totally inappropriate to what was happening. That is kamikaze thinking, just saying by rote. And incidentally, the president said on his speech that the plane was going 35,000 feet up and that no other plane does that. There's no way it's a spy. And I read in the newspapers this week that the spy planes like that altitude of 35,000 because they get an overview of 120 miles. So that was just one of his outright lies. But you have to tamper with their awareness. Now, the first thought was that they were hijacked because there was no awareness that they responded verbally. Keep in mind that the only thing that's happened so far is that the Russians have talked to Russians. The Koreans didn't warn the Korean pilot. The Japanese didn't warn. The Americans didn't warn. We have a budget of about $22 billion for security and communications. That's just the CIA, but the National Security Agency has more. Wouldn't you think that they would have told them you're off course? The radar would have registered. These pilots had no indication and no response. And the one article by a pilot said they had to be asleep. Another one thought they were hijacked. So after they said we're going up to 35,000 feet, 2 minutes later they were shot. So it doesn't make sense. There are a lot of ways to control people, but that is an inappropriate statement at that time after being told to flip your wings or turn on your lights or signal or we'll down you somewhere where it's safe. That they simply said the last thing was, we're going 35,000 feet. The next thing you have to do is fix the outgoing radio communication so they can't relay their question. Nothing came in. No radio word could come into them, and nothing came out. The next is you have to equip the computers in some way. There's 10 different sections, and they had to be altered because according to the airline experts, there is no way. And if there is no way, then they were tampered with back when it started, because the explanation is that they do a trial run, set the computers, it tells them where they're going, and never in the history of the Navy operations, Army operations, Air Force. Have they ever had an airplane with air agencies going where they've had trouble like this? They haven't had a passenger plane that went so far off course with no radio communication in or out. There are 10 different sections, and according to pilots, they had to be altered in some way in order to get there. The next thing you have to do is to prepare editorials and response in advance, long before the facts come in. You don't have to have facts. In fact, even on NBC News tonight, they were saying that the president was pretty strident without the supportive facts, that we'll wait and see. Now, in a few weeks, I'll read you some documents of Carl Rowan, who worked with the CIA, a columnist, on what they would do when the Warren Report was published. And next week, I will not discuss the airline. I'm going back to the Warren Commission and the murder of John Kennedy for the reason that Larry MacDonald had such an important part in his organization down in Atlanta, Georgia, with the World Odessa Network, that I want to get back to the Kennedy almost every other week because it's the 20th anniversary of his murder. It's enough to talk about his murderers, but I want to go into that. But I will do in a few weeks what Carl Rowan said. He was called by the Warren Commission, and the CIA was asked to sell the Warren Report as accurate the day it comes out, because the memos to each other were saying, and paraphrasing it, was, you have a whole new audience, and you tell it to them now, and they will remember it. And don't equivocate, because there's critics to what we're doing. And we have an unprepared whole audience, and you tell them, this is the way it happened, for example. Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. Don't leave anything to chance. Be sure that this is the definitive work, this is the final work. Well, the editorials in response had to be prepared in advance. I have a bunch of them here that were written. There is no way they could be written in one day after the plane went down when they really weren't sure of the circumstances. So that the martyrdom of MacDonald and getting him out of the way because of his links to these new scandals could be done, and it served the cause anyway, and a lot of people have been off that way. And they prepared this martyrdom with a lot of speeches of what he said and what the liberals said, and now the liberals should be put down and so forth, and we'll do more on Larry MacDonald. Another way that you have to take this off is that you have to fly into Soviet territory, and you don't accept landing or moving. You just simply go straight with no reason or no sense, and they're forced to shoot you down because the law says if you go over their territory and they flap their wings and circle and turn on the lights and some other missile bullets around that aren't fatal, if you don't respond, they shoot you down. And also it is a fact that passenger planes in the United States, United Airlines and TWA and Pan Am and so forth, are supposed to be privately, we have our own Air Force and the Navy flyers and so forth, and CIA to do the spying. But in countries where there's a fascist dictator where they own the airline, such as Somoza that did in Nicaragua, or the Korean CIA, and the pilot in this plane was the pilot for the president of Korea, flew him to Washington recently. He was a military pilot taking orders, okay? And these planes are owned by these countries, and they do the spying for the countries. And in return for the commercial airlines spying for the countries, they give the information to the CIA so that the CIA doesn't have to fly the plane. But over South America, Central America, Asia, the Middle East, Israel owns its own airline. They do the spying, and then they turn the information to the CIA. So this had to fly into Soviet territory and just go straight. And then they had to monitor the Soviet communications, and there's no information on, as I say, that any other communication between Korea, between Japan, between the United States could see that they were off course or follow it. They followed every word the Russians said from air to ground, but they don't have a record of anybody else, and I think that's kind of weird. They had to ignore everybody else's intelligence system and say the Russian said this to the Russian, and the Russian said this to the Russian, but that's it. Okay, we'll take a 1-minute break and get back some more on the fatal 007, remember, James Bond, that's License to Kill. Now we'll get back. This is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. It's Mae Brussell, and we'll begin side 2 of this broadcast. It's number 613, September 5th, 1983. before I go more on Larry MacDonald and that airplane that went over Moscow and went down, well, we assume it did. They still haven't found the parts. There was a party in Vail, Colorado that reminded me of a party at the home of Clint Murchison the night before John Kennedy was killed. This party took place, it was described in the New York Times, August the 29th, 1983. It took place in Vail, Colorado. There was a conference of world leaders, and the party was hosted by Gerald and Betty Ford. Pictures of them dancing in the New York Times. Attending this little cozy dinner was Helmut Schmidt of West Germany and Gerald Ford, United States, and Gustave d'Estaing of France. These are all deposed monarchs. James Callaghan, Callaghan, formerly the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Prime Minister formerly Malcolm Fraser, Fraser, of Australia. What did they have in common, this little group? They described themselves on the front page of the New York Times as, what we have here is a beautiful experience, a conspiracy of former world leaders against present world leaders. And then they said, thank God none of us has the power to alter anything anymore. And then along with the party is a picture of Herr Henry Kissinger, always in the operation. What do they have in common? Covering up or contributing to the concealment of the assassins of John Kennedy. Of course, Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission. Helmut Schmidt was in Germany with the Reinhard Gehlen operation. Gustave d'Estaing worked with the Permindex, the group that had tried to kill Charles de Gaulle. Mr. Callahan in London has Samuel Cummings of the CIA arming Frank Churchill and George Corkula and the terrorists all over the world, Mr. Carlos, Mitchell Ward Bell. All these people are involved, such as the Nugan Bank. Mr. Fraser was put out just recently. Oh, that's another country that went socialist, is Australia, and they're investigating the Nugan Bank. All of these people, Helmut Schmidt, Gerald Ford, Gustave d'Estaing, and James Callaghan, and Malcolm Fraser, are part of the narcotics traffic, the Henry Kissinger group, the Western goals that Larry MacDonald was part of, the links to the military, the drug traffic, the Vatican connections, the Masonic Lodge, Licio Gelli. I'm using a lot of names that some of you may not be familiar with if you don't listen every week. But they had a little party in Vail, Colorado on August the 29th, and a man they worked with and closely with, Larry MacDonald, went down 2 days later. And a lot that Larry would be subpoenaed to talk about, or if he would be exposed to through courts, if he ever lived long enough, could go on up to them. So his death is similar to George de Mohrenschildt at the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or William Sullivan of Division 5 of the FBI, or John Rosselli, or Sam Giancano, or Carlos Prios-Sequeiros, when the House Select, or Gary Powers of U-2 flight, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was investigating who killed John Kennedy. There were about 20 murders within that summer and fall that just followed one after the other of primary witnesses, so that the committee never really rubbed up to those people who had a part in the assassination. They stayed a safe distance away. And also, when you wipe out these people, the next person isn't quick to testify. Now, if this was a provocation, as I say, you'd tamper with the instruments, and there was evidence that they could not change or were not aware of what they were doing, and the instruments were simply taking them in. And also, they said, as I said before, that pilots could be asleep. I doubt if they were asleep if they said we're going up to 35,000, because they didn't say anything else. There's no record of what they said, and it's all still wide open. The Kremlin, according to newspapers this is the Monterey Herald and LA Times, remains unapologetic. They are holding on to their story, and what they said is, does Mr. President, that's Ronald Reagan, believe that the very concept of national sovereignty no longer exists, and one may intrude with impunity into the airspace of independent states? Or is he viewing the whole world now as a zone of U.S. vital interest? And as I've said before, I didn't see him crying elephant tears about Jonestown with 900 American citizens. We were talking about that earlier on the talk show before this came out. He simply didn't care. The Soviet Union said he's crying elephant tears now, but he's missing the point. And they asked questions in the San Francisco Chronicle last Saturday why the American authorities resort to all kinds of dirty insinuations about the USSR, but they did not try to establish contact with their airplanes or warn them or tell them to get back on the course. They ask that question. They're attacking the Soviet side as a deliberate violation of what they should be doing. The Soviets were protecting their territory. They said one's attention is drawn to the fact that already in the first reports, reference is made to the Central Intelligence Agency, and further reports have increasingly grounds to consider that this flight was not accidental. It was indicative of the post factum that the American only wants to hear one side, and that they want to continue this breaking up of Détente and Cold War. And the Soviet Union was quite aware of the techniques that the newspaper and the media have been pushing around. Ernest Lefevre, Lefever, you may know the name, had an article in the newspaper in editorial September the 2nd. That is quite soon after Larry MacDonald died and the plane went down. And he has a story, the Soviets are brutal, but we must negotiate. And in this, just a 2-column story, he says they're brutal. They are brutal. They are run by scofflaw regime. They can't be constrained by normal behavior. They have a long record of official Soviet repression. And it goes into the fact they're not ordinary people, that they dominate the world. They don't work on principles or objectives that we have. And he goes into yellow rain and Poland and Afghanistan. He doesn't talk about Chile and Argentina and El Salvador or Brazil or Bolivia or Uruguay or Paraguay. They have their usual shtick. Well, Lefevre is a part of the office of General Graham of High Frontier, a formerly Defense Intelligence Agency, who shares the offices in Washington, D.C. with Fritz Kramer's mentor, Fritz Kramer. Graham lectures, I had on the broadcast a few weeks ago with John Reese. They were recently in Colorado. Reese is of Western Goals with Larry MacDonald. So you get an editorial of a man who, if you don't know Lefevre, you think he's just righteously indignant. But all of a sudden, he's in the offices with General Graham, Daniel Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and John Reese, and Louise Reese, his wife, who works for Larry MacDonald. So you're not getting an objective editorial. You're getting a story that had to be written, that was hot off the air with all the details. Now, if you want to go back to May 1983, I did broadcast 599, broadcast 600 and 601 on Larry MacDonald, of his links to Western Goals, J. Peter Grace, and Zyklon B and Auschwitz, the Otto Ambrose connections, the list of Larry MacDonald to Strom Thurmond and the Vatican and the Reinhard Gehlen operation, and to the Munich massacre in Germany in the Olympic Games, and the George Habash of Beirut, Lebanon, and Fuad Habash, his brother, in Santiago, Chile, and Dr. Anthony Malek, M-A-L-E-K, of the CIA in Chile and Lebanon and Atlanta, Georgia, and Larry MacDonald with gold smuggling and robberies and heroin and cocaine and art galleries, and how Robert Byron Watson told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that this gang was the syndicate, was Murder Incorporated, and so forth. Now, the minute Larry MacDonald begins to be subpoenaed for the LAPD, he's silenced. His plane is down. Now, the Birchers have a lot of stories this week. Birchers believe the Soviets downed the plane to kill the group's leader. They don't believe that Dorothy Hunt's plane crash went down to protect Richard Nixon. Anti-communists, the likely target. MacDonald, the vocal foe of communism. The Birch Society calls it murder. MacDonald's family and friends are outraged. The victims of the ill-fated plane. The ultimate irony ends MacDonald's career. Of course it's irony. He should be killed at the hands of the communists so that they continue his legacy. Representative Larry MacDonald, staunch foe of the Reds. He kept the dream of the House Un-American Activities and listing people who haven't committed crimes into computers. That was his dream, and that's what he was doing, and he was doing with people like the Pentagon and the Crime Syndicate and the Roy Cohns. And if I repeat those names, don't forget it. Now, August the 1st, there's an article in the LA Times and San Jose Mercury on how the state spied on political groups. August the 18th, the Los Angeles Herald says showdown on the police department. That's the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, PDID. Showdown on the documents. They've been subpoenaed. On August the 18th, the Washington Post finally had a front page story. Anti-left group probed in LA secret files. August the 18th. And I took note of that because by August 23rd, The police files were going to have to be turned over to the Civil Liberties Union by August the 25th. 430 documents linked to Larry MacDonald and Western Goals, and computers that went back and forth going way back to 10 years ago when they were supposed to be destroyed and were illegally kept, put into his computers. The Washington Post gave him a front-page story on the 18th, and he was dead on the 31st. It's by Michael Martinez. Anti-left group probed in L.A. secret files case. In Alexandria, Virginia, the Los Angeles grand jury issued a subpoena to the executive director of Western Goals, a private foundation formed in 1979 by Representative Larry MacDonald, with plans to develop a computer file on those who seek to bring revolutionary change in America. If you want an abortion, you're revolutionary. If you don't like napalm in Vietnam, you're a revolutionary. If you don't like people being beheaded and cut open in El Salvador, he considers you a revolutionary. If you don't like certain actors or movies, or if you read certain books, or if you review books in the newspaper, or you produce certain plays, you get into a computer. If you have certain jobs, Larry MacDonald turned them over to corporations. Do you want to hire these kind of people? John Reese, who works for him, will sell a profile of you to any corporation in the United States. If you think the blacklisting is over, forget it. It's been going on, and a lot of good people still can't get jobs. They can't get cut records. They can't get contracts for whether it's opera or light opera or singing or writing books or book publishers. He will sell to them everything about you that he thinks he doesn't like because he interprets it. And don't forget, as I said, on the board of Western Goals is Admiral Moore, a sleazy guy that was stealing from the President of the United States, as if Reagan is so great society. I mean, they steal from each other, but they get, if you read about Admiral Moore in the new Seymour Hersh book, you get a little bio of him on Western Goals. And as I mentioned before when we were talking about this, Edward Teller, he invents a hydrogen bomb, and if you protest against it, Larry MacDonald puts into a computer because you're supposed to like his hydrogen bomb. So Western Goals was asked after it was revealed that they had these files to turn over to the ACLU and the police department information. They want to know what kind of information was fed to Western Goals. See, it went to a police detective, Jay Paul, that I did those broadcasts on before, who's married to Mary Love, and she's a lawyer down Long Beach, and he would take cartons of data banks from the police department and petitions and so forth, and then put them into data banks and send them back to Larry MacDonald. Then they go to 50 states around the country with the Pentagon. See, the Pentagon's not supposed to keep these lists. And they admitted they're judges and actors, and John Reese was taken over the carpet in New York, and they've secreted these things. Now, the L.A. Times reported, this was last week, this was in August 19th, the Washington Post was saying the L.A. Times asked that Jay Paul turn over all the computer floppy disks, the printouts, the storage tapes, which the foundation, Western Goals, had been receiving from Jay Paul. Now, you get those, and you get a different picture of Larry MacDonald and who is in and recorded on those tapes, and then you can sue under Freedom of Information Act. And there, once the story broke, where these things had been for 10 years, people were looking for them, and they were in the hands of the computers of Larry MacDonald. It wasn't long before MacDonald was made a martyr and sent off to the next world. Communist, left-wing organizations, and they were asked to turn these over. This story has been brewing in Los Angeles. I take the Los Angeles Herald Examiner. I take the Los Angeles Times. There's no one around the country who subscribes to these broadcasts who has any information about John Reese, Western Goals, or Larry MacDonald. And they get it through these broadcasts, and I copy articles for them. But finally, the Washington Post did have a story about the lawsuit. There was a story, PDID, that's the department. The detective is distrusted. Another story, the LA Times, August 25th, after the front page story on the 18th of Western Goals, and it refers to the right-wing Western Goals Foundation and how they supply an organization called Research West, formed by FBI officials, and they compile information on anti-nuclear activists and turn it over to the energy corporations. I'll put all of those articles in order, and particularly the ones that are mentioning Larry MacDonald and the 180 boxes of intelligence material that was taken to the home of Jay Paul to put into Western Goals. There's a story in the L.A. Herald, August 28th. This was 3 days before the plane went down. About 180 boxes of intelligence material, some of it allegedly ordered destroyed by the police commission in the mid-'70s, has been recovered from the data banks of Western Goals, and they've hired lawyers for J. Paul. Now, this John Reese and Daniel Graham that work with Western Goals and Admiral Moore have a reputation with gathering material on anybody they don't like and putting it all into computers and data banks, and they are a very dangerous group. As a matter of fact, I got a clipping from In These Times, August the 26th, just this last week, Spies versus Spy. And he said when Ronald Reagan wants to bait the nuclear freeze movement, he cites Reader's Digest and their expose of the Soviet manipulation and infiltration of these groups. And he quoted in one of his speeches John Reese. And it goes on to say that in the article in the Village Voice in New York, they said that John Reese was exposed as informing on the left. He never belonged to the left. He published Information Digest, and he's been a paid informer for the government and a snitch, and that he works in the offices of Birch Society Chief Representative Larry MacDonald. So the Village Voice is writing about Reese and MacDonald, the L.A. Times, the L.A. Herald, and the name is not publicly in not many states associated, but it's very important. A lot of stories. I have maybe 200 articles on Chief of Police Gates and Larry MacDonald, and one of the splinter payoffs of this MacDonald death is probably that it'll reduce the tension at the Olympic Games, because he was planning a lot of violence, I believe, and was part of the Squad 19, the LAPD, and the files, and maybe with the connecting links to the military and the police department tied up in lawsuits, it may prevent some of the Reichstag anger whipped up if there's terrorists at the Olympic Games. If you see Ronald Reagan handling the news and the press, the way they are doing this Russian story on the airline, you can see what they would do if they picked up a terrorist in Los Angeles. Well, just quickly, what are some of the indications that this plane is sabotaged? I'll run down a few quotations from articles this week that I've been cross-filing. As I say, 007 is licensed to kill, and no explanation of why no voice coming out from the airplane or not receiving messages. Chung Bin-in, C-H-U-N-G, B-Y-U-N-G-I-N, of the Korean Airlines, was the pilot for the president of Korea when he came to the United States. He's a very strong man. He was in the Japanese Korean Air Force. He's Korean intelligence, and very influential, powerful man to go down with the plane. But if he got orders to keep going straight, he went straight. The London Observer said, has a story also this week about a flyer who disappeared with a strange parallel, and often in the news, like that book, Black Abductor, as a reminder of that today, that came out before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. The London Observer, August the 28th, just 4 days before this plane went down, has a story called Spy Plane Mystery Deepens, and it's about a book just coming out now, The Flyer Who Disappeared, and it's a Swedish fellow whose father disappeared, and it's described as one of the most embarrassing, highly charged mysteries of post-war history, how this Air Force captain went out, left home, went into the Soviet Union. He had a Swedish military plane, a DC-3, and he listened to Russian naval exercises, just as this Korean Air Force pilot could be watching Russian exercises or picking up pictures. The plane was used for spying, just as this plane was used for spying at high altitude. And the Soviet Union, when they find the parts of that plane, you'll find spy equipment similar to Gary Powers in the U-2. The crew of that plane never returned in 1952, and right now it's 5 days that they haven't admitted or at least found the bodies of those people. There were no distress calls on record. It simply disappeared, and there were no distress calls here. The plane simply accordingly went down, but this is just 5 days and very unusual, no report of it. The incident caused a major disruption between Swedish and Soviet relations and almost forced Sweden into the NATO membership. And this is causing major disruptions between the Soviet Union and the United States and Korea and Japan. And the outrage Ronald Reagan wants to get will whip you up to a lather. This book tells about how Sweden was not in NATO, so they would spy send spy planes over to Russia and then turn the information to NATO because NATO wasn't supposed to be doing this and Sweden wasn't supposed to be in NATO. The crew allegedly was kept captive, and this fellow thinks that his father was alive or was seen there. But it was covered up, and it was a provocation that broke off Sweden with the Soviet Union and pushed them to the side of the Western world because the Soviets were so terrible. And actually, the plane was a spy plane, and it wasn't supposed to be, but it severed the feelings of people towards the Soviet Union. Now, the United States has been spying on the Soviet Union since World War II, our ally. The New York Times has a story of the strategic bases there, how we deliberately planned flights there to get Soviet response in the 1950s. This is the New York Times, September the 2nd, that we have deliberately planned flights to get a response, that we know the Soviets have orders to shoot down the aircraft, and even though they're approved in Moscow, we have deliberately provoked them. The Soviet Union said they ignored 9 earlier provocations of this type that they knew were going over them. The San Francisco Chronicle had an editorial September the 3rd, unanswered question, how was the aircraft equipped with sophisticated electronic navigational systems straying into Soviet airspace? A retired U.S. Air Force Major General George Keegan, also with the Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger Foundation, their group, says we don't know and never will know who gave the orders. But the Seattle Times had a story. If we monitor Soviet aircraft speaking to Soviet ground command centers, why couldn't we listen to the United States, not the United States, the Korean pilots or the United States intelligence telling them they were off course? That was a question from the Seattle newspaper, September the 2nd. An American manned radar facility is stationed in Japan and, according to the Seattle paper, probably tracked the airline to its destruction. Well, why didn't it warn it? If a American manned radar facility tracked the airliner to its destruction, which is a quotation from the newspaper, the Seattle newspaper, September the 2nd, then the question is, why didn't they warn it? This Seattle paper said nothing flies over or near Sakhalin, Sakhalin, that we, the United States Air Force, don't monitor. This is a quotation from the Pentagon. There's eavesdropping by the United States and the Japanese, and also the military radio transmission listeners are graduates of the language school at Monterey, California, and also San Angelo, Texas. The San Francisco Examiner, September the 4th, said there are substantial odds against human error or equipment malfunctioning for considering a 2.5-hour diversion from normal flight path that led to the airline Flight 007 being more than 300 miles off its course. The substantial odds against this human error ever happening. This was the San Francisco Examiner. The New York Times, September the 2nd, said the pilot was in constant communication with his ground control, describing the sequence of the movements. The American officials didn't have real-time information, that their information is put into some computer and retrieved months or days later. Do you believe that there's no communication between Japan, Korea, United States, and planes going off their course, that this is all academic and they pull it out of some box later, but only the Russians know that we're inside their territory? The LA Times, September the 2nd, says the Japanese military said that the Korean pilot may have erred on their location. The pilot had a mistaken latitude and a longitude. In the final 17 minutes of the plane, the digits in the latitude and longitude were different and opposite to the locations that they had tracked. The pilot told Tokyo he was 147 degrees longitude and he was 141, and he said he was 41 degrees north latitude and he was 47. So the 147 and 141 and 41 and 47 were completely off. And the LA Times said the radar pinpointed them flying at 141 and 47 degrees north. And there was a switch in the digits given by the pilots that was completely off. Why did it go off its course? The LA Times, September the 2nd, said the experts can't figure why it stayed so far from its planned course. There are 5 air lanes from Anchorage to Tokyo, and it's 38 miles away from Soviet airspace. The Korean jet is equipped with 3 separate units, and this is important. They're modern computerized flight control systems that are in use at all times, and they are set. The jumbo airplane is set automatically, and the crew makes periodic inputs of flight plan into the computer. If the plane flew off its course, 400 miles off the course, where was it supposed to be flying, and how could they get there if they had 3 ways to check? Another story in the Los Angeles Times, September the 2nd, the Japanese defense can monitor the voice of the Soviet pilot, and the United States monitors heard the radio transmission as they talk, but again, they don't hear the other 2-way. It's not a 2-way. Isn't that interesting that the one up above flying, you can monitor what they say to each other, but you can't monitor anybody in the plane in control of all those people in that plane. The New York Times, September the 3rd, said the National Security Agency is a worldwide network of electronic eavesdropping stations, and it is clear that the route flown by the airliner was off its course for a sustained period of time. There was one article I read that it was off for 7 hours. There was a question of where it was for 7.5 hours. In Canada, up in British Columbia, the Globe and Mail, I picked up the newspapers because I was up in Vancouver this week. It said the plane last heard the pilot report his position up 35,000. I mentioned that before. And the pilot gave no indication of any trouble at all. Not at all. And the weather was good. The radar was only 180 kilometers north of Hokkaido, Hokkaido. And actually, it was 560 kilometers as against 180. Their last response, when they vanished off the radar screen, they were going up to 35,000, and they were not heard for 7.5 hours. Now, that's something we're not getting in the American newspapers. 7.5 hours they weren't heard, and they were followed for 2.5 hours. That's a long time, and the National Security Agency, according to the New York Times, tracks these airliners and watches what they're doing. The New York Times, September the 3rd, said the National Security Agency, one of the pilots said, we know it was a premeditated act, a deliberate act, and yet they haven't accounted for the way the equipment didn't work, the direction, the height, the longitude, and so forth was off, and there was no response to any signals. They didn't react to signals. They didn't react to warning. They went higher up to where the Japanese say there are spy planes, and the Koreans say, and the CIA admit there are spy planes. Another story in the LA Times said that in order to get a deliberate act of aggression like this, you'd have to have your story ready to collect the information of what happened to have it pat. Well, certainly the president and members of Congress and the news media, the columnists, the Birch Society have had their story so pat that by September the 2nd, there were at least 100 articles on this damning situation. Not 100 articles asking questions, just 100 conclusions, articles over and over again with the worst words of the bestiality, the terrible character, the character assassination. You can't trust them, they're brutal, and so forth. Well, I'll do some more on the Kennedy assassination next week, and then I'm going to get back to Larry MacDonald and his organization and his role with terrorism in the Los Angeles Police Department. But that's all we have time for this evening. This is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU in Pacific Grove, California. Now, interestingly enough, we don't have a disc jockey in tonight. You know, it's Labor Day, and he isn't here, so I may put on some music for you. Diane, find some music for me. Hi. My daughter's here, and she likes music, and until we get the blues, we usually get the blues on KAZU. We'll turn on some music. Let's see what mood Diane's in. I'll be disc jockey tonight and give you a little bit of music. How would that be to follow World Watchers? Because the people that listen to this program for an hour and a half are going to rest. Okay, let's get a nice. What's your choice tonight? Elvis Costello, Little Triggers. She likes Little Triggers? Okay, Elvis Costello, you're coming on. And Mae Brussell is going on right now. We'll put on Elvis Costello.